Welcome back, welcome back. This week marks the 40th anniversary of the Six-Day War in 1967, the war that changed the Middle East so drastically that its people still feel the effects of it to this very day. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been described as a Gordian knot by some, a dispute so deep it is impossible to resolve. So let's try and be helpful, positive. The dispute centres on two main issues. First, the borders of a future Palestinian state. Here's what they looked like in 1967. Now the borders look like this today. Secondly, the right of return for the displaced Palestinian refugees, many of whom continue to live in camps across Jordan, Egypt, Syria and Lebanon. There are an estimated 4.2 million Palestinian refugees. Some people say as much as 5 million. Many analysts suggest that the key to the whole dispute lies with these two issues. If the Israelis can be persuaded to withdraw to their pre-1967 borders and the Palestinians to forego their demands for the right of refugee return, it's argued that real breakthroughs can then be made. Well, joining me now to discuss all this from Ramallah is, delighted to see her again, Hanan Ashwari. Hanan, welcome. Do you think that this idea that these two basic points are where we've got to begin, and is it practical to think of the Palestinians, in fact, giving up the right of return and the Israelis giving up all their gains from 1967? Is that possible?
Well, I think it's probably not the right approach. I think if you start by telling people what are they going to give up, they're not going to give up anything. But if you start by addressing the requirements of peace and by re-legitimizing the language of peace rather than violence and coercion and occupation, if you begin by unraveling, let's say, the consequences, not just of the 1967 war, but also of 1948, that attempted to eradicate and deconstruct Palestinian reality, then perhaps you'll be addressing the core issues. The permanent status issues are always defined simply as Jerusalem, boundaries, settlements, refugees, and of course then you talk about security and voter rights. These are issues that have long been defined as the key issues for permanent or final status settlement. But at the same time, there are other issues that are quite serious, issues of validation of narratives, issues of legitimacy, issues of understanding the basic inherent injustice and inequality in a situation of occupation.
But in terms of getting a settlement of some sort, is the question of the right of return of refugees, I mean, and where 5 million people could go in Israel, it would be difficult to work out, obviously, but is the right of return non-negotiable? Because if it is, there are going to be no negotiations.
Yeah. Well, to the Palestinian people, any leader, any person who starts by relinquishing the rights of the refugees has immediately relinquished his or her right to represent the Palestinian people. There is a certain requirement that you cannot approach any resolution by abandoning a right, by abandoning legality, by saying that the Palestinian refugees have to be dealt with in a way which is different from all other refugees in the world, that you have to acquire the Israeli perspective on the refugees and therefore begin by saying these are a group of people who are outside the law, who are not given the protection of the law, and who are, in a sense, who have to be dealt with as an obstacle to Israeli or Zionist aspirations rather than as an issue of justice.
Where, if 5 million Palestinian refugees did return, where would they go when they got back to the Middle East?
Well, I'm not a demographer and I'm not a geographer. There are those who have specialized in studying where the Palestinian refugees can go. The Palestinian refugees require, first of all, as I said, the right to have their narrative and their rights recognized, but two, they have the right to choose. And therefore, they have to be given options so that they can choose. Some of them will choose to go back to where they came from, but I know that Israel has totally destroyed over 500 villages and so on in Palestine, and they don't exist anymore. They might want to go to a Palestinian state if it is there. They might want to choose a third option. There were in Camp David and afterwards in Taba, there were 4 or 5 options discussed. But it seems to me in this interview we are not going to sit down and negotiate the plight of the refugees, and you're not going to find Palestinians relinquishing these rights when we are still living under a situation of occupation, of horrible repression, that is creating even a greater brain drain and even more refugees as we speak, because Israel is still stealing the land, building the wall, oppressing the Palestinians, destroying our economy, destroying our freedom, and then saying, well, the problem is the refugees. The problem is the occupation. The problem is the lack of willingness to deal with the Palestinians as a nation with rights, not as a people under occupation, deprived totally of the protection of the law and of any kind of positive intervention to end this state of captivity and to end Israeli escalation of violence and land theft.
Thank you very much, Hanan. We've covered a lot of ground, and it's a joy to see you again, and thank you very much for joining us. And joining me now is Talya Lador-Fresher, who is the Deputy Israeli Ambassador to the UK. Welcome, Talya. Let me ask the question, roughly the same question in reverse that I asked Hanan there. The question being that if the Palestinians were to forego their right of return, would Israel, in return, be willing to go back to the boundaries that existed back before the war in 1967?
I believe this is exactly what we are calling for. When we are talking about a two-state solution, we mean a national home for the Jewish people and a national home for the Palestinian people. I will not sit here and draw any boundaries with you, but generally speaking, I think the concept of land for peace is the concept that not only did we agree to in the past, but we've already also opted to in the past. What was our peace agreement with Egypt? It's land for peace. What did we do in 2 years ago when we started this engagement process? We hoped at that time that it would be or lead to land for peace with the Palestinians.
And of course, since 1967, there has been some progress in terms of contacts with, as you said, Egypt or Jordan, in terms of relations with them both. There's things in the papers at the moment that people are hopeful that there'll be a similar relationship between Israel and Syria. Mm-hmm. Is that on the cards?
Well, we'll have to wait and see, because what we are wondering is whether the calls from Syria are calls for real negotiations. Is Assad really going to cut a deal that his father did not? Or is it just a calls for negotiations for the sake of negotiations, and then everybody is wasting their time, and actually the Syrians have something else in mind? The fact that the Syrians are still taking a very hostile stand and are hosting, for example, the very radical Palestinian groups in Damascus is not a good sign. If Assad really means peace, then he should give some signal, a positive signal to Israel, what he means by peace. And then I think Israel has conveyed in the past its willingness to sit and negotiate with the Syrians without preconditions.
I've read several places that recently, people reviewing the Arab-Israeli conflict and so on of '67. And I've read people saying that, in a way, interesting theory, I think, that Israel almost did too well in that war. I mean, it got so much in the way of land from the three opposing people, and it made it into Israel into an occupier and so on, which is a less popular thing to be than not to be an occupier. The idea that you did too well in that war is an interesting theory. Do you think it's true? No,
I think if we would have done poorly in the war, you wouldn't sit here and interview me. If we would have done poorly in the war, probably it would have meant the destruction of the only Jewish state. The intentions of the Egyptians were very clear, and they said it on the radio. I remember as a young girl in kindergarten during that time how frightful we all were that the Egyptians are going to throw us all into the sea. This was what was on Radio Cairo at the time. We are going to take the Jews and throw them over the sea. So I'm not going to sit here and apologize for winning the war.
And in terms of peace actually breaking out, peace coming and so on, do you think it'll come in my lifetime or a much longer period, your lifetime?
Well, I hope you a lot of good wishes for health. It will depend what is happening to what is evolving on the Palestinian side, because what we see now is actually a coalition of the moderates on the Arab side, the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Gulf countries, and the moderates on the Palestinian side. Unfortunately, we are yet to see if the moderates or the extremists on the Palestinian side are having the upper hand, because the current national unity government, so-called, is actually a Hamas government that does not recognize Israel, that calls for its destruction, it does not renounce terror. So with such representatives of the Palestinian people, those who want to live on the ruins of Israel and not alongside Israel, we will not be able to achieve peace.
Thank you very much indeed. Of course, we could also talk about the Israeli raids on Gaza and the West Bank make it more difficult to find moderates as well, of course.
Well, as you know, after we disengaged, 7,000 settlers left the Gaza completely, and all Israeli army redeployed. And in return, we got 3,000 Qassam rockets to the southern part of Israel, which is certainly within the green line by every map that you can imagine. So we have to protect our citizens.
We'll leave it there. Thank you very much. We leave the negotiators of the world to take it from here, really. That's all for this week. Join me again in 7 days' time for another Frost Over the World. Bye for now.